Okay, sir. Okay, then let's start today's webinar. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Unlocking the Potential of Carbon Markets in Pakistan. With the recent launch of Pakistan guidelines on trading in carbon markets, we are stepping into an exciting new chapter for climate
Good
action.
afternoon, everyone.
This session will cover governance, challenges, corruption risk, and strategies for a transparent and inclusive carbon market. Before we begin, let's go over some ground rules for today's webinar. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the session to avoid background noise. If you have any questions, share them in the Q&A box. It will get addressed during the question and answer segment. Please keep your comments. Moderator, Mr. Kashif Ali, Executive Director of Transparency International Pakistan, whose expertise in governance and accountability makes him the perfect guide for today's discussion. Over to you, Kashif Saab.
Thank you, Raima. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. As I know that some people are joining from different time zones, but thank you and welcome to today's webinar on unlocking the potential of carbon markets in Pakistan, especially focusing on safeguards for transparency and equitable solutions. Now, before we get into the panel discussion, I just want to set the stage. And the stage, I think, is what a lot of us are already familiar, that Pakistan, as we all know, remains the fifth most vulnerable country to climate change. And our ability to deal with the climate effects and build resilience from our working experience suggested that it really depends on the capacity of our climate governing institutions to raise appropriate amount of climate finance. Early last year, Transparency International Pakistan did an assessment of the climate financial inflows in the countries, our estimate suggested that Pakistan has received between $1.4 billion to $2 billion over the last 10 years per year, every year. And this amount is exponentially lower than what the World Bank's estimates, around $348 billion that Pakistan needs to deal with the effects of climate change leading to 2030. Now, against this backdrop, I think the conversation is happening, as we all know, that the carbon markets are being increasingly seen as a way to bridge this climate finance gap. The Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that was operationalized at COP29, it allows countries to voluntarily cooperate with each other to achieve the emission reductions as outlined in the country's nationally determined contributions. Now, Pakistan, again, I think, as we know that given it's an economy with a very low carbon footprints, so there is a clear potential that we have as a country in terms of carbon markets. So it holds an enormous potential. And I think in this regard, it is also important to highlight that we as a country achieved a big achievement in terms of putting in place the national climate finance strategy, as well as the Pakistan's first guidelines on trading in carbon markets that were launched at COP29 and approved by the federal cabinet in the last week of December. Now, this means that now Pakistan can implement green financing projects by selling emissions in markets. The Transparency International Pakistan, at our end, we have been running a climate governance integrity program, which is a global program of TI. And there we have been working at national, subnational, and local level to ensure that how can we make climate policies and decision making inclusive of all stakeholders, as well as ensuring that these decision makings are accountable. In October last year, we engaged with the MOCC when the carbon market guidelines were being drafted to highlight that there are very serious risks of transparency, accountability, and integrity. Also important to highlight that it is imperative that a big achievement in terms of include a robust governance climate side as well as transparency metrics based on the global best practices. Carbon markets. And I think that would be accountability the guidelines document that is in place do include a lot of these proposed recommendations, and also in terms of providing an overall roadmap of how we make sure that there are high integrity projects. So today's webinar is also on our side is an effort of ongoing series of conversations that we have been regularly organizing on climate governance, bringing experts on both mainstream knowledge about carbon markets, about green solutions, and more importantly about how we initiate a conversation around these conversations that we have been regularly organizing on climate governance, bringing experts on both have knowledge about carbon markets, about green solutions in the context that in coming months, as the guidelines come place in Pakistan, we'll be finalizing frameworks and rules through which many of these credits will be registered in the national registry and thereby offered to the international investors. So transparency and integrity is really key in terms of talking about both the implications and potential. And I'm very grateful to the distinguished panelists that we have today, as well as the international investors who have joined us. Our panelists today, they come from different backgrounds, but they have been working on different aspects of carbon markets. That we have today in the conversation, I think that we'll be engaging for an hour, will shed light on how Pakistan can benefit from this. So first, we are joined by Ms. Sana Rasool. Sana is carbon market specialist at the Ministry of Climate Change and Environmental Coordination. She has worked very closely on the draft guideline that is in place, including having a very active, participations in conversations around Article 6 at COP29. We are joined by Mr. Brice Boomer. Brice leads Transparency International's work on climate governance and integrity for more than a decade. And his work includes managing and implementing and monitoring different projects on focusing on transparency, accountability in climate action. We're also joined by Mr. Zarak Pasha, who is head of carbon finance with the Standard Chartered based in London. Zarak has a long experience of working on carbon pricing and carbon market projects. So without taking further time, let me start our panel. And to kick off the discussion, I think my first question would be from you, Sana. As I also highlighted, so we know that the carbon market has become functional in Pakistan after the federal government approved the guidelines. We also know that how the government wants to capitalize on Article 6. And simply, I think also to bridge this climate finance gap that we have been talking about. Now that the regulatory framework is in place, how do you and the MOCC view the role of carbon markets in terms of achieving our climate goals as outlined in NDCs, and also specifically if you can give us an overview of the guidelines on trading in carbon markets which are in place for our audience to understand and also to mainstream knowledge of this.
Thank you, Mr. Kashif. I hope I'm audible. Thank you, Mr. Kashif, and thank you, Transparency International, for organizing this very insightful, very important discussion on carbon markets and putting together a very impressive panel of stakeholders who will make a difference, making Pakistan's carbon market either successful or otherwise. So it's very interesting to be here today and to talk to all of you. Before I get into the technicalities of the policy guidelines, I just want to share a few insights from COP29 because I was one of the technical negotiators on Article 6 for Pakistan. So some of the discussions that were taking place in those negotiation rooms and how those led to the decision on Article 6 that we have in place after COP29 and how that decision translates into our policy guidelines and further regulatory framework that is being built on that policy guideline. I would like to take a moment here to appreciate the senior command here at the Ministry of Climate Change, the Honorable Coordinator to the Prime Minister, our Secretary Climate Change, the Additional Secretary. This time, I think we have a different momentum than what we had in the previous decade, and we've adopted a proactive approach in cashing opportunities rather than just taking a backseat and observing what is going on. So it's a healthy development, and we have on board several technical experts who are working on streamlining this market and making Pakistan competitive, right? So before beginning a technical discussion, I want to put it out there that the carbon markets are for the people of Pakistan, and the government is simply merely there to facilitate the people, the project proponents, the developers, and in ensuring, as Kashif Saab has rightly mentioned, transparency of the entire process, not only for Pakistan, but also for international stakeholders to see that our markets are trustworthy and that this is a viable solution going forward in climate finance dispersion around the world. So coming to the negotiations first, and then the guidelines, the policy document that's come out. During the negotiations, the most critical aspect was what Kashif Saab has just very rightly highlighted. It was transparency of the entire process, right? If we are going to come out of that Kyoto Protocol and establish a new setup for voluntary carbon trading, then it has to be transparent. We have to avoid double counting, and we also have to avoid low quality internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or A6.4 ERs, from getting into the market, right? So on that context, there's a robust set of requirements, reporting requirements that was introduced in the decision. But because several developing countries at the moment lack the much rigorous reporting requirements, that language was toned down. But let me assure you that in Pakistan, the highest level policymakers and decision makers are in agreement that we should take that spirit of reporting, robust reporting and transparency forward, and report on those guidelines. So the national registry that's being developed, the monitoring, reporting and verification framework, the MRV framework, that will entail all of this. And for project developers or project proponents who wish to take part in the market, I think this is important for all of you to hear that there's no compromise on the quality, right? So the integrity of Pakistan's market depends on the quality of ITMOs that will be introduced into the market. So therefore, robust requirements for meeting those quality targets are in place. So now let me just quickly go over the key elements of the policy guidelines. But before that, you should all be aware that a set of rules and regulations, very comprehensive rules and regulations, are going to come out shortly. So that's a work under progress, and that is derived from the policy. So essentially, what the policy entails is a process of how project proponents can participate. The process is to submit to the nationally designated authority, which is the Ministry of Climate Change, a project idea note, a PIN, right? And that would be the document. A format of that document is included in the guidelines, the essential components that are needed in that PIN document. That would be the first document which will be thoroughly evaluated technically, and a letter of intent would be issued based on that project idea note. The letter of intent is essentially the document which will give go ahead to the project developer to design a detailed project design document, PDD. So the purpose of a letter of intent is that the project is viable, it can be traded in the international market, the government can take it into a cooperative approach whenever we have a cooperative approach ready, and the project developer should work out the details of that document. So there is a time frame of around 2 years that's been given to the project developer to work out all the details in the design document, a very comprehensive document which will be thoroughly evaluated not only within the country, but also through the technical expert review of the Article 6 body. So the project design document is supposed to tell the cost of that project based on the baseline data. It is also supposed to include information on the abatement potential of the project and the time span of how that project will unfold, and what will a risk mitigation plan, a monitoring framework, all of those elements need to be included in the project design document. So once we have that design document, the Ministry of Climate Change, as the nationally designated authority of the UNFCCC, would then issue a no objection certificate translating into a letter of authorization for that given project. right? Now, authorization as per the decision in Article 6 is a national prerogative. So once that authorization is obtained from the government, the project is then ready to be traded in the international market. So if there's a cooperative approach that's already established, the government will facilitate the project proponent in taking that project into that market, or it can also be used for other mitigation, internationally determined mitigation purposes, such as CORSIA, which are the aviation credits, and non-CORSIA users as well. So, so that would be the fate. So that mitigation outcome, once it has the authorization from the nationally designated authority, it becomes an internationally transferred mitigation outcome, an ITMO. And if it's for the Article 6.4 project, it becomes an A6.4 emission reduction ER, A6.4 ER, which is then transferred interchangeably into the A6.2 registry as well. So it is then available to be traded as an ITMO. That is the story of how an ITMO is born, and a 6.4 ER is born, and how it is traded in the market. But very importantly, coming to the elements of transparency and additionality, these are the core requirements. So number one, when the project design document is submitted, it's important that the project proponent accredits that design document and the mitigation outcomes from a verified, recognized accrediting body, so that we can avoid any sorts of loopholes or risk. That, and then there is an MRV framework that is under development at the moment. The MRV framework would be put in place. There is regular reporting under the Article 6 framework, the initial report that would undergo a very stringent technical expert evaluation. And if inconsistencies are identified, then the ETF under Article 13, the Enhanced Transparency Framework, which includes the national communications that will be submitted annually, and the biannual transparency report will have substantive portions on carbon reporting. So these steps have been put in place not only on the international level, but integrated into national policy to protect the market and to ensure that only the highest quality ITMOs are out there being traded, and there is no risk of double counting. So these are some of the key policy interventions in place. Besides these, there is a robust benefit sharing mechanism that has been stipulated under the policy guidelines, and it's also going to be further elaborated in the rules and regulations that are taking shape. So benefit sharing essentially means that the project developers or the communities which own that project should get the maximum benefit out of it, right? So in ensuring the quality and the priority of the ITMOs to be traded under cooperative approaches, the idea that the government is taking forward is that projects which have the maximum benefit for the community and SDG Go benefits attached to it would get the maximum recognition and maximum priority, right? So that helps to ensure that, for example, if it's a forestation carbon credit project, then the individual or the entity who owns that tree that owns the carbon credit, and maximum benefit goes to that individual or entity. So that is the idea behind it. But I think it's a work in progress, and it's for all stakeholders to contribute to. So I would be very interested in learning from the rest of your speakers and contributing to the ITMOs are out there being traded, and there is no risk of double counting. So these are some of the key policy interventions in place. Besides these, there is a robust benefit sharing mechanism that has been stipulated under the policy guidelines, and it's also going to be further elaborated in the rules and regulations that are taking shape. So benefit sharing essentially means that the project developers or the communities which own that project should get the maximum benefit out of it, right? So in ensuring the quality and the priority of the ITMOs to be traded under cooperative approaches, the idea that the government is taking forward is that projects which have the maximum benefit for the community and SDG Go benefits attached to it would get the maximum recognition and maximum priority, right? So that helps to ensure that, for example, if it's a forestation carbon credit project, then the individual or the entity who owns that tree that owns the carbon credit, and maximum benefit goes to that individual or entity. So that is the idea behind it, but I think it's a work in progress, and it's for all stakeholders to contribute to. So I would be very interested in learning from the rest of your speakers and contributing to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sana, for such a comprehensive overview, and also as you focused on some of the integrity measures that are embedded in this policy framework. Brice, if I can turn to you. So you have worked on transparency and accountability in climate finance. So how does Transparency International, more at a global level, view carbon markets? So we heard from the ministry on the policy and some of the mechanisms which are part of it to make it more ethical and high integrity. But if you can briefly describe some of the transparency risks that are inherently associated with carbon markets, and what steps can a country like Pakistan that is going into this can ensure that the carbon markets are not only effective in reducing emissions, but also make sure that these are inclusive and the tangible benefits reach out to the communities.
Thanks, Kashif, and thanks to TIA Pakistan for organizing this interesting event indeed, and very interesting to hear the latest updates from Pakistan. And thanks, Sana, for presenting, and congratulations for the guidelines. Yeah, I wanted to maybe kind of zoom a bit out of Pakistan and give you a bit of the kind of general context of carbon markets and the issues we've been seeing around transparency and some corrupt behaviors. We've been constituting for the past couple of years what we call a corruption case atlas that is available on our website, and we have, or there is a dedicated section, so to speak, on carbon markets, and it's about 15% of the cases of corruption related to climate projects and initiatives that are related to carbon markets. So it's quite an important share, so to speak, and we see more and more of those corruption problems or corruption allegations linked to carbon markets. Another aspect, maybe in terms of what kind of issues are there, and what we've seen is that a lot of those issues are linked to consultation and FPIC-free prior informed consent. But they also have quite often transnational nature that reflect as well the nature themselves of the carbon markets, right? So maybe I give you a couple of examples just so that it's kind of concrete what kind of issues and how it translates. There is a big project in Kenya, for example. It's called Blue Carbon. It's supposed to be one of the largest soil carbon removal projects. And there, the local communities, and I think it was good to hear from Sana that, this is something that is important for Pakistan, because those local communities in that case and in many other cases were not properly consulted. And a lot of several hundreds people have been forcibly relocated there. When we go to another continent, in Mexico, for example, there have been reports that on another reforestation scheme project, several farmers have been forced to pay kickbacks to public officials in charge of that project, so that they would stay included in that project. There has been also another case in Zimbabwe, for example, where a South Pole project, quite large one as well, has in the end achieved very few benefits, and the importance of the benefit sharing system as well, and the community there is shown in terms of how much they got in the end, which was far less, almost half of what was promised initially. And the list goes on and on. So I could give you also other examples. There have been also some cases that have been going to the courts or in being investigated, was in Brazil by the federal police, and with suspicion of around more than $30 million of illegal carbon credits being sold. Also in the US, there are ongoing investigations as well about several schemes that are very large. So just to give you an idea of what we are talking about, and also in terms of impacts, what it means. So it means very few or even negative benefits for communities on the ground. And it means in terms of environmental impacts, either, again, very few or none almost. So there has been also several studies showing that. There has been a large investigation in The Guardian that showed that 80% of the top 50 emissions offset projects have been basically considered as junk or worthless. There has been also a research project by LSE, the London School of Economics, that showed that half of the Indian CDM project, so the previous mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, would have happened anyway. And there we touch also another aspect or another type of corruption that I will come back to, which is linked to potential conflict of interest that are quite often in the field. So I think that it's not that we are against carbon markets. We see the potential benefits of them, but we need to be very careful, because there are, in terms of how the carbon markets are designed, some flaws or some tensions. Because if you look at conventional commodity markets, normally at least the purchaser would have an incentive to obtain good quality products. But in the case of carbon markets, there is not such a strong motivation as long as the credits are kind of recognized, no? So there is not that incentive of participants to that market to also investigate the origin of the carbon credits. And that leads to this tension or to these increased risks compared to other types of markets. And this is not new, no? I mean, Interpol more than 10 years ago already noted some of the different ways of manipulating carbon measurements, for example, to claim additional carbon credits that puts the whole system in a difficult situation. And then maybe just briefly to give you a couple of risk areas, so to speak. There is another particularity in terms of carbon markets, or not a particularity, but an importance of intermediaries in those markets. And there is also a risk of market manipulation, which means that some participant can influence the market for private gain, either through inflation or deflation of those prices. And the fact that those carbon markets are often opaque, and that's the importance of transparency, and the prices are often secret, with, for example, most of the intermediaries, around 90% of them, according to some studies, are not declaring their fees, for example. So those transparency problems arise of this opacity. So every initiative to increase transparency is very positive. In terms of the project implementation, which is another area of complexity and risks, those climate and carbon projects, often the ones also, or in particular the ones related to forest sector, are very vulnerable to corrupt practices. They are most of the time in faraway locations, so those are increased risks or increased barriers and difficulties to make sure that the local population is included and will actually benefit from those projects. And the other area that I wanted to mention that I previously just alluded to is in terms of the verification. So here there is also kind of an inherent tension between in terms of how the verification is being organized, and even if it's a third-party verification, and including verifiers like Vera or others, there is often this tension because the project implementers are the ones that are paying directly the verifiers. So here there is a clear conflict of interest in terms of how the independence of the verifiers, and those we feel are still very much under-regulated or not well addressed. And this is the same also not only for verifiers, but also in how the supervisory bodies are being constituted. And we saw that again in terms of the previous mechanism, the CDM under the Kyoto Protocol, where it was there are some projects that were showing that there were clearly a better chance for a project to be approved if the country was represented on the board that was approving those projects. And lastly, I just wanted to mention as well that there is a number of corruption risks related to the financial nature of those markets. So we've seen a lot of cases related to fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. And even here in Europe, where I'm based, there has been a lot of loss and public finance loss because of a VAT, like a VAT carousel, what we call, which happened, for example, or which costed France, for example, almost 400 million. So that those are the kind of main risk areas or how we see them. Kashif, do you want me to now look into some kind of solutions, or do you want me to pause there?
So I think we can we can leave that for the latter part. But
Okay.
Thank you for sharing that some of the global knowledge that we have, and I think it's very useful. As Sana also highlighted, that a lot of these are also already being considered in the policy. But I think it also have a good conversation on why things need to be focused on. Zarek, if I can now come to you. So I mean, what we understand, the way the carbon markets work is that we put price on emissions, and then Article 6 provides us a framework for integrating that price into the financial system. Now, for Pakistan, there is already a major carbon credit project going on in form of Delta Blue project, and it is expected that it will generate around $240 million. And so I want to understand from your working experience, in your opinion, what are some of the key sectors in Pakistan that could generate carbon credits? Is it solar? Is it clean cooking energy? And if you can also share some examples of other markets which have taken benefits from similar sectors. And I think I will also add one another area, if you can talk about that also, which relates to the pricing mechanisms. And I know that you have worked on this. And what do you think? I mean, for regions which are still developing, what is strategies or what regulatory? How important is the role of the regulatory framework for such pricing strategies?
Thanks, Kashif. Thank you first to Transparency International for the invite to this session. It's an honor to be speaking alongside distinguished panelists today. Just by way of introduction, first, I'm Zarek Pasha. I head carbon finance for Standard Chartered Bank. Globally, I sit in London. For those of you unfamiliar with Standard Chartered Bank, we are a UK headquartered bank with a 170-year presence in emerging markets. We're the oldest bank by presence in Pakistan, for example. Same case in many other emerging economies. From a sustainability perspective, the bank has a net zero target by 2050. And for banks, achieving net zero means our clients have to achieve net zero, because most of our emissions are actually the emissions of our clients. So we're completely incentivized to ensure that our clients are on track for their own net zero goals. In addition to that, Standard Chartered has a $300 billion capital mobilization target by 2030, so deploying $300 billion towards green and transition finance activities. Within the carbon space, we are one of the most active carbon trading outfits out there. We have a trading desk that trades both compliance carbon and voluntary carbon out of London and Singapore. We own a carbon exchange in Singapore as well, together with Temasek and the Singapore Exchange, called Climate Impact X. The project you mentioned, Delta Blue, was auctioned on our exchange, and we have, as Standard Chartered Bank, been one of the most consistent purchasers of Delta Blue carbon credits over the past few years as part of our own net zero requirements. In addition to that, we also own a carbon settlement platform together with 8 other banks called Carbon Place, based out of the UK. So definitely very keen to build the infrastructure and our own capabilities around supporting our clients in the space of carbon trading and carbon finance. I personally look at carbon financing within the bank, and last year we piloted our first carbon removals financing, which was the first removals financing by any bank anywhere globally. Together with British Airways, facing a project developer that was doing enhanced rock weathering in the UK and Canada, and we're looking to now explore those same types of opportunities in our emerging market footprint, because that's our bread and butter. That's where we want to do most business. And then just lastly, on focusing on transparency and integrity and regulation. This is one area where banks are screaming for more regulation, more transparency, and more integrity, because the only way carbon markets can make a meaningful difference to the net zero equation is through scale. And the only way we achieve scale is by giving sellers and buyers confidence that what they are trading is robust, right? So this is an area that is screaming for regulation, and that's why everything that Ms. Sana laid out in her comments was music to my ears, right? It was a pleasure to see Pakistan's presence at COP29 in Baku. I think the MOCC did an amazing job of setting the stall for what Pakistan has to offer. And not many countries, I would say, are ahead of the curve compared to Pakistan and going about things the right way. So I'll start there now. Kashif, to your point around what sectoral opportunities do we see in Pakistan, and how do we draw comparisons to other places where we do business? You just have to look at the emissions profile of Pakistan, and that gives you the answers, right? What are the top most emitting sectors? So if you look at Pakistan, I think out of the 490 million tons that the country emits, I think more than 40 to 50% is the energy sector. So first and foremost, the grid needs to be decarbonized, right? Now, what are the carbon opportunities within it? Now, coal, obviously, if you look at places like Indonesia and Philippines, they have similar issues with a lot of coal powering the grid. Early decommissioning of coal-fired power is a space that I think is being very actively explored to generate transition carbon credits. The US, under John Kerry's leadership, has an initiative called the Energy Transition Accelerator that is looking to work with countries that have those coal-intense grids to see how they can be incentivized to decommission coal-fired power plants 10, 20 years before their technical useful lives end, right? And if you look at the average coal-fired power plant, you're talking about millions and millions of tons of emissions that can be avoided, right? And in the case of Pakistan, it's particularly relevant because many of the coal assets are relatively new, right? So I'd start there in terms of like the lowest hanging fruit, the largest opportunities in the energy side. Then obviously there's how you use that energy as well, right? So energy optimization, energy efficiency. This is where I think about things like cooking devices type projects. I think numerous parties have done studies in Pakistan. I think there's a massive opportunity around cleaning up how we cook our food. And that can have a knock-on effect on reduced deforestation as well, and relieve some pressure on that system, plus all the co-benefits related to health. It's encouraging to see that there are projects already emerging on the ground that are looking at this theme. And I can tell you from an international perspective, there's a lot of interest from buyers and investors for Pakistan to start putting out its first Article 6 compliant clean cooking projects, because they see a robust framework. Now they want to see projects coming through that robust framework. And we've seen multiple countries actually were working on opportunities, Article 6 clean cooking opportunities, and financing them already in places like Africa. So we're very familiar with the ecosystem. I think it will be important for Pakistan to set up as many of those cooperative approaches with various countries, so that you create a demand engine for a high quality asset when it comes to market. Um, Moving on, I think if you go into the second most sort of relevant sector, it's agriculture. So in the agri space, obviously tackling methane is a big theme. When you look at methane, obviously you're looking at both agricultural waste. There's lots of solutions around agricultural waste, livestock waste, and there's also opportunities around how you actually farm your land, right? So in places like India, even in the US, you're seeing projects around the whole rice farming theme. In many economies, you're seeing how livestock waste can be translated into renewable natural gas. So there's opportunities around that, given the size of the large dairy farms in Pakistan and whatnot. There's also a local opportunity in how that biogas can be powering rural households and rural installations. So that's another theme. And then the third, and I'll pause there, and there's lots more, right? But the third I would focus on is transport and electrifying the various fleets, particularly in urban centers in Pakistan. Big opportunity. I won't get into nature, but I think Delta Blue is already a great poster child. Delta Blue plus the 10 billion tsunami together can show you how massive the potential is in terms of both carbon sequestration, but also attracting international dollars for that carbon sequestration. Delta Blue itself has attracted the interest of Microsoft and Trafigura, and from an international perspective, these are big names, right? So if you've been successful in getting that money into the country, there's a lot more waiting to get in. And I think the work that has been done with regards to creating that robust framework will be extremely important. Now, I'll just go towards the second part of your question, Kashif, which was around pricing. And like any other market, I think firstly we should stop thinking about carbon as a different market. We will be best served by thinking about carbon as any other commodity. And our goal should be to make carbon look and feel like a commodity, because that's how it will scale. The problems that we need to address in making it a truly robust commodity is to have a very good base of which to build on, right? So Standard Chartered Bank has been a key sort of player in promoting best practice and standards. We sit on the board of the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, and the reason we sit on the board is because we felt that there was a big quality gap. I think the first thing that we can look at in terms of pricing. Pricing is a function of demand and supply, right? That's as simple as it is. Now, when you look at demand, regulation would best serve pricing by first being clear, second, creating natural demand engines, both domestically and internationally. So when you look at domestic, regulations should create an incentive for companies creating local emissions to decarbonize through those carbon projects as well. So investing in carbon, creating some kind of compliance requirement locally. So if you look at markets like Singapore or Indonesia or Colombia or South Africa, they have a local compliance carbon market, which has a carbon price. And you can either pay that carbon price almost like a tax, or you can buy an eligible carbon credit and use that in lieu of the tax, right? So that creates a local natural demand engine to be using carbon credits. So if any international company has operations in Pakistan that are creating emissions, the policy should incentivize them to buy Pakistani carbon credits, to offset that requirement. That's a local demand engine. Similarly, internationally, if cooperative approaches are set up with various countries, then at least there will be some demand on the back end. So you can see in the case of Singapore, in the case of Switzerland, they have set up these cooperative approaches with various emerging economies. And so an international investor can see that there is a natural home for this carbon credit at the end of the process internationally as well as locally, which creates more confidence that there is a liquid market on the other side, right? So pricing is determined by these types of factors, and then that's demand. On the supply side, you're best served by just having really clear guidelines around how you're controlling for quality, how you're enforcing that quality control, why your market is robust, transparent, high integrity. And I think that automatically drives price up from a cost up perspective, right? So there's both demand and supply at play here. And that's what ultimately determines the price. Beyond this basic price determination, then you can have more price elevation based on things like a corresponding adjustment, whether it's a nature-based product or a energy efficiency product. That's where buyers' personal preferences sort of come into play. That's where corresponding adjustment prices come into play, which are slightly different depending on the technology, depending on the market. But all of these in entirety is what helps you determine a price. And we've seen this play out in various markets. If you have a compliance mechanism, your voluntary price will approach that compliance price over time because it makes sense, right? Until you dry up the supply, it will be below, and then it'll reach the compliance point, and that's where it'll stay. If there's no compliance price, then it's going to be purely a demand supply equation playing out.
Thank you very much, Zaref, for this great overview of the sectors and also on the pricing strategies. Now, I was planning to also have a second round of the question, but I think there are very interesting questions in the chat box. So maybe perhaps what we can do is to keep the chat open for the next 15 minutes or so that we have. Any participant who have the question, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself and ask your question, or also refer to which speaker you want to refer to. So the first one, I think, Yusuf Sir from Forest Base. Maybe if you can quickly ask it over the microphone, or if you want me to. Then we have a question from Sonia. So the first question is, are PDDs prepared for GHG programs acceptable for MOCC, or is there a separate template?
Yes, so I'll quickly answer this one. There is a dedicated template for the PDDs, but I think more importantly at this point, it's the PIN document that will matter, because that is the first document, the project idea note, where the NDA, where you'll be telling the NDA what is the abatement potential for that project, and going forward, what will be the cost of that project. And based on the information that's provided in these PINs, the marginal abatement cost curve for Pakistan will be updated. So basically, the abatement cost curve will then prioritize projects based on their cost and their adaptation, their abatement potential. So that, I think, is critical. But there is a specific template for the PDD as well as for the PIN.
Thanks. So second question that we have, what specific policy reforms or guidelines is the ministry considering to operationalize carbon markets in Pakistan effectively? I think
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Kashif over here, I think it's a very good question. I just wanted to clarify over here that there are two types of markets that we're talking about. One is the voluntary carbon market, and the other is the Article 6 market, which is the cooperative approaches and the 6.4 mechanism. So essentially, the idea is that because it is a voluntary carbon market, so as few regulations as possible, except only to ensure transparency and to ensure that there are no challenges or no let's just say embarrassments for Pakistan on the international platform. So just that part. So the VCM very, very open for project proponents to trade into that market and to get in touch with the buyers and trade their projects. And the Delta Blue Carbon project that my fellow colleagues have just mentioned is one of our success stories in the VCMs. For the Article 6 market, we've got robust regulations in place just for ensuring the transparency. As Brice very clearly mentioned, that there are several challenges. So based on these case studies, international case studies, and the lessons that we also learned from our colleagues, negotiators at COP29, we have tried to incorporate these elements. Particularly in terms of benefit sharing with the community, that the benefit must go to the project proponent, the designer who has created that project, and in terms of MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. But I have picked up some very interesting points from Brice and from Zarak as well, and I will be taking these up in future and trying to find a roadmap on how we can tackle these to make the market more transparent. Because at the end of the day, competitive advantage in the international market would depend on how transparent one market is over the other. So if we want to go with that approach, I think we should incorporate the very valuable suggestions that Brice and Zarak have shared.
Thanks, Sarah. The next question that we have, does carbon market trading have influence on NDCs, either in mitigation or adaptation?
Yes, absolutely. Another very good question. Now, this is very interesting. Wanted to cover this at the beginning of the discussion, but it just slipped by. So one of your questions, Kashif, at the beginning was that are carbon markets the right way of looking at mitigation and in terms of achieving our NDCs? I think there's a catch in this market here as well, because, and that catch is essentially, if I have to sum it in one word, it's overselling. So if countries oversell carbon credits, then I feel that it's very counterproductive to the idea of using carbon markets as a platform for gaining climate finance. And in Pakistan, at least, I can speak for Pakistan, that there are safety measures in place to protect that overselling. And those are being crafted in the rules and regulations, but we would do our best to avoid overselling these projects. And we have a cap. If you look at the guidelines, 5% of those traded mitigation outcomes go towards Pakistan's own NDCs as well. So at the same time, there are projects, even domestic projects, that are contributing towards our own NDCs. But we want to incentivize the private sector to reach out and grab that finance wherever they can.
Thanks. The next question is, Brice, to you. What best practices can Pakistan adopt to ensure transparency and prevent corruption in carbon credit trading?
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's, we discussed already a couple of kind of areas, and I think I would try to maybe summarize into, for me, 5 key points. The first one is, as we were just hearing, the importance of transparency. There need to be like full transparency around the deals, the access to project design documents, and having registries and transaction logs and robust reporting. So I think it's very encouraging to hear that, this is something that is recognized as important and planned for Pakistan. Because I think often there is transparency provisions can be kind of overridden by arguing that there are some confidentiality concerns, and I think we need to be very careful about that argument. The second one is around accountability and participation. We discussed this also. Clear benefit sharing schemes are very important, and making sure that they respect community rights and the benefits are actually reaching those communities on the ground. And I think there are some interesting pieces of legislations in other countries, like Kenya, for example, that has a benefit sharing bill, or Zambia that has like some frameworks that require the following some international standards when it comes to consultations. And number 3, as the fellow panelists were saying, regulations. I think that's also key. So it's good to hear also that this is planned further regulations in terms of the implementation of the guidelines in Pakistan. And those regulations need to ask project developer to assess and to address the specific corruption risks that exist when it comes to carbon markets and projects. And they need to be sufficient monitoring capacity as well, and law enforcement. Because I think there is this question of how much capacity and resources and staff in the end of the day is allocated for the authority that will monitor the regulations and the markets themselves. Number 4, I mentioned it before, conflict of interest frameworks, especially for the verification aspect. So how can authorities verify the verifiers, so to speak, and also do some spot checks? That's a solution. And last one, accessible compliance mechanisms and whistleblowing protection. Most of the time, the cases of corruption are being brought up by whistleblowers, and this is key because if we don't know, we can't correct the problem. No, we can't address the problem. So in the US, the derivatives market regulator has issued a whistleblower alert relating to fraud and misconduct in carbon markets specifically, and they created a dedicated task force as well on environmental fraud. So that's something that could be also maybe inspiring for Pakistan.
Thank you, Brice. And we have a couple of questions for Sana. So the first is, would there be verification system for carbon credit from MOCC, or would the accredited bodies be used?
Yes, absolutely. The Ministry of Climate Change, as the nationally designated authority, will conduct its own monitoring and verification of the PDDs that have been submitted. And I can also explain rationally the reason for that, because as the NDA, the ministry is responsible for submitting that letter of authorization, right? So when it's issued from the NDA, then the NDA becomes responsible for the integrity of that mitigation outcome and the A6.4 ERs. That is why there will be a robust verification and monitoring system in place based on evidence, on scientific evidence. And Zarak mentioned a few of the key areas where Pakistan is going forward and where there is potential for carbon trading. One of the key challenges that these areas are facing, I think it's also the right time to highlight some of these in light of what Brice has mentioned in other countries. One of the key challenges is data, right? If we look at the agricultural sector, we would need very high quality baseline data to evaluate the current amount of mitigation, the current amount of emission from the sector, and then future mitigation. And how are we going to monitor that? In terms of cook stoves as well. In the forestry section, it's rather relatively easier because of GIS and remote sensing technologies. So I think there's better visibility. But for example, if we compare that to a cook stove project, then it's slightly challenging, right, to identify and to verify on ground whether what has been claimed in the PDD is actually what's being done on ground. And those are some of the technicalities that we are working around. But we'd always welcome stakeholder input on how we can best verify and regulate these, because in the interest of Pakistan's presence in the market, I think we'll have to work very hard on ensuring integrity for the carbon credits that are being traded there. But to answer your question briefly, yes, the ministry would have its own MRV system to verify those credits. Yes.
And the last two questions, I'll club them together. So is there a specific criteria for the project verifiers? And secondly, how was the CAF, the corresponding adjustment fee of 12% was determined by the ministry in terms of federal and relevant provincial governments?
Yeah, I'll answer the second one first. On the corresponding adjustment fee, there has been a lot of back and forth between the provinces. It's been a very extensive stakeholder consultation process. And I can give a justification of what this fee is, because there's a lot of misconception around this 12% figure, and it's rather intimidating for lots of people. So the idea behind it is that 6% of this corresponding adjustment fee, first of all, let's understand what is corresponding adjustment and whether it applies to all projects or not. Essentially, a corresponding adjustment would be applied when there is a cooperative approach underway and when Pakistan is selling its credits to another government or another entity, right? And when that risk of double counting has to be avoided, so corresponding adjustment is applied to avoid that. So in order to apply this corresponding adjustment for a cooperative approach, there is a 12% corresponding adjustment fee, 6% of which will go into the climate fund of Pakistan. And this fund, once again, is going to go to the provinces. The other 6% goes directly to the provinces. The fund is essentially a structure which will take adaptation projects, priority adaptation projects into provinces, right? So this fund has been created for that purpose. For example, it can be for climate resilient infrastructure. It can be for, a loss and damage project and a climate emergency project. So that is where this fund goes in. And this 12% is on the net revenue that will be generated from the project. So the number actually becomes pretty small compared to, so this is not on the 12% is not on the overall cost of that project, overall, the value of the project. It's on the net profit that comes from the project. So essentially the value is not too high. And this has been calculated to keep Pakistan competitive in the market, but it's a bare minimum at the moment, and it's with consultation from all stakeholders, especially provinces. I'm sorry, I missed the first question. So there were two questions clubbed together. If we can have the first one as well.
Yeah. Is there specific criteria for the project verifiers?
I'm assuming that by project verifiers, we're talking about the accreditors, the international accreditors such as VERA and Gold Standard. Because of the newness of this market, we heard from one expert at VERA a couple of days ago, and they said that they are also in the process of developing, certification and entire regulations on this. So everybody is working towards that end, and so is the ministry in terms of its rules and regulations. There are gray areas at the moment, I'll agree, but we are, seeking more clarity and trying to make it as transparent as possible.
Thank you very much. I think this today's webinar and the panel, the insights that each one of you brought has been very useful, and there has been a lot of interest, as we can see from the questions that are being asked in the chat. And I think this was also the objective on our end, that how can we bring different expertise on board so that we can talk about these important topics and important areas. And I think it's also clear that at the beginning, so we have the policy frameworks now in place, which is a big achievement for a country. But then how do we also make sure that we achieve a good integrity projects? How do we make sure that these projects translate to local communities? How do we make sure that there are effective channels of communication that go from federal to provinces to local to private sector? At the end, so that we can have the projects that translate into effective outcomes. And so we will move towards the conclusion of today's webinar. And I'll request my colleague Raima if you can have a concluding summary and with a note of thanks.
Thank you, Kashif. Really wonderful insights were shared today on carbon markets and their role in Pakistan climate goals. To wrap up, Ms. Sana highlighted the importance of the new carbon market guidelines in bridging the climate finance gap and fair benefits for communities. Her reminder that this effort is for the people of Pakistan emphasizes the need for inclusive, people-centered climate action, where Bryce shared valuable perspective from global projects, stressing the importance of strong governance and anti-corruption measures to keep carbon markets inclusive and effective. He also raised concern about market manipulation and need for robust safeguards. Zarak discussed the impressive work being done by his organization, sharing opportunities in renewable energy, agriculture, clean cooking, and clean energy, and to generate carbon credits. He also highlighted strategies for balancing local needs with global standards. Big thank you to our speaker and audience for your engagement. I hope we continue working together to make carbon markets a powerful tool, meaningful climate solutions. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.